Hello, everybody. My name is Peter Dorrington. I'm Chief Strategy Officer at Anthrolytics, but I'm delighted to be the host of this discussion about enabling AI through data ecosystems. And joining me today, we have two marvelous experts. So we've got Esther and Raymonde from Capgemini in the Netherlands. Now, in Esther's work with the European Commission's data.europe.eu portal and support center for data sharing, Esther is increasing the impact of data via trusted collaborations. By engaging with public and private organizations and academia, she encourages successful data sharing for a common European data space and policy making. Now, Raymonde is part of the data strategy and data science team at Capgemini Invent, and she's heavily involved in two European Union projects, data.europa.eu and the Support Centre for Data Sharing. And together with her team, she leads the communication streams for both projects and engages with organisations in the open data and data sharing domain. So then, today, well, what an interesting world we find ourselves in. We've got smart cars, wearables, cloud platforms, all driven by shared data. If you're in business today, you're in the business of data. In fact, to make any innovative technology in the field of artificial intelligence and big data possible, we not only need access to larger volumes of high quality data, but we also need data ecosystems in which data can be exchanged. Now, in our talk today, both our experts are going to share what they've learned over the years and how to realize the full potential of data ecosystems. So welcome to you both, Esther and Raymonde. It's a pleasure to have you here. So I've got a couple of topics I'd like to discuss with you. Let me start with this one. What is the connection between data sharing and big data?
Yeah, thank you for that introduction, Peter. So as our society is becoming increasingly connected, we rely more and more on digital interoperable tools. Think about everyday activities like sending a text. If you make a spelling mistake, it can be automatically corrected. Or you arrive home at the end of the day and you want to turn on the lights, you can simply ask Google Home or Alexa to do that for you. Now, many services like customer support, online translation services, autocorrect, speech recognition, and many others are all developed with large sets of data. And in this case, it's language and translation data. Now, with these data, we can develop AI and machine learning applications that make these tools like speech recognition, automated translation possible. They make your life easier, but they also facilitate communication. Now, for Google Home or Alexa to understand you, it does need to be trained in your language. So it could be that your native language is not recognized because there's no training data available for it, or because people who train the models cannot use it because of copyright. Often we see that the people who need the data are different from the people who will hold rights to the data. And through the European Commission's Support Center for Data Sharing, we were able to learn from data sharing practitioners firsthand how they can overcome challenges like these. One example that we were able to get to know through our initiative is TAUS, a think tank that transformed the idea of data sharing into that of a marketplace, where buyers and sellers come together to exchange data for machine translations. This not only ensures access to data, the fact that it is monetized also ensures that the data is of high quality. And it brings low research language data to the marketplace. One of their users, for instance, sells a data set for translating Yoruba, which is a West African language, for English to English, translated from Yoruba to English, for different science, technology, and medicine applications. Now, the main motivation of the seller is to contribute not only to the digital survival, but also the representation of his native language. As for data privacy and ownership concerns, this can be bypassed by working only with open source data. Now, providing translation data also has a more positive effect for the community in terms of education. This particular seller, for instance, translated a great deal on climate change, saying that in his home country, in Nigeria, people don't know about climate change as much as the rest of the world. So he's providing some kind of public service to educate his community through translations. And this example shows that sharing data, in this case language data, has advantages in both directions. It helps big tech to make their products more inclusive and reach broader audiences, but it also allows entire communities to gain access to information. Now, another example of the value of data sharing is offered in the health domain. One of the data sharing practitioners that we interviewed for a project last year is Allegro AI. As a provider of operational tools, they help companies manage their machine and deep learning products and bring their solutions to market. Now, for one of their clients, they created an AI workflow automation project for surgeons, giving them another set of eyes in the middle of a surgery by using computer vision. This helps them make more informed decisions and create better outcomes, but also sharpen their skills. And this project combines information from computer vision, the surgery itself, and AI. And integrating these data points needs extensive computing resources to incorporate every possible type of surgery that they aim to improve. And the need for big data is really clear here, as it allows to train the models for many different variations and situations. The same goes for developing new drugs to cure diseases. To properly conduct studies, medical researchers require large samples. And biobanks, hospitals, or population genomics initiatives often have these data, but they're not directly findable or usable for researchers. So another company that we interviewed as part of the Commission's project is LifeBit, which connects data custodians and data consumers by providing a tool that allows research to access and analyze these biomedical data that are still often in silos. Generating large amounts of biomedical data has become quite straightforward now, but the challenge is for organizations to access it and utilize it because it's stored across thousands of disconnected locations. Now, what we've heard is that often the tools that collect and share personal data bring concerns around rights and privacy. Yet to enable a digital society, the collection of that data is needed. So we need tools that make it possible without harming privacy. And in the examples I just mentioned, the concerns can be mitigated, for instance, by keeping data sets on site so that movement of highly sensitive data is avoided. And what we have observed through our interviews with data sharing practitioners is that the common aim of them is to create an environment that makes it possible to collect data and seamlessly exchange it while still securing and protecting the rights of individuals. And they emphasize that it is crucial that a level of control is established that still leaves room for collaboration and innovation, and where the trade-off between control and convenience is limited. Balancing the potential for digital tools with the need for privacy is really the underlying theme in many of the talks that we've had. And coming back to the initial question, actually, when we think of big and complex issues like curing diseases or even climate change, we not only need access to a tremendous amount of information, we also need to be able to look at it from multiple viewpoints and incorporate knowledge from various experts. It works the same way with data. To truly create value from it, we need data from different sectors and from different experts. We cannot do it alone. We really need others.
Okay, thank you, Raymonde. I don't know, Esther, if you want to add anything to Raymonde's comments there. You're still on mute.
We are automatically muted. That makes sense. So I think for the moment that is really the connection that we want to make, which says like there is no big data without big data sharing, because if we have one source with a lot of data, we cannot really call that big data anymore, because big data is also big value and big impact. And that's what we have when we bring sources together. And I'm sure we will touch on sovereignty of data sources, individuals in the next half hour. And I'm sure I'll have my point there. Thanks, Peter.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, it's interesting. I'm going to come back to that, I think, at the end when we do the Q&A, because I know I have a question, which, by the way, I just want to remind everybody, please do ask questions for Raymonde and Esther in the Q&A tab in the comments. We'd love to take your questions. We'll answer as many of them as we can. But let's carry on with this conversation then. So, well, yeah, if we've got the technology in place to share data, and it sounds like we've made great strides there in both repositories and data sharing protocols, what else do we need? So it's not just having the repositories, is it? There's more than just the technology.
Yeah, definitely. So with the Support Center for Data Sharing, we've been in a unique position to research and disseminate European policy around data, but also learn from businesses and organizations firsthand where the opportunities lie and which barriers to data sharing exist, be it both real and perceived. So to answer your question, I will also look at it from two perspectives. So firstly, from the private sector, we've heard the misconception that only the AI or technology to develop their products or services is needed. Yet at the same time, they're often unnecessarily worried about compliance. So rules like GDPR, for instance, are often perceived as extremely difficult and burdensome to comply with, and perhaps even as an obstruction of the free flow of data. Yet we believe that rules like these actually enable the free flow of data because it makes it clear what is allowed and what isn't, whereas before businesses were operating in the dark, so to speak. So rules that specify how data should be used are definitely needed because they set the rules of the game. Now, on the other hand, ensuring access to data is also a European ambition. According to European Parliament, data only has value if it is aggregated, refined, and used in the right way, which is also what I hinted at in the previous question. So some businesses might not even know what can be done with data, like, for example, industrial machines. And through more data sharing, new business models can emerge, more efficiency can be achieved, and products can be improved. But to enable this again, to enable data access, we need legislation and funding. And with the PSI Directive for Open Data, more recently the Data Governance Act, and now the proposed Data Act, the policy to enable the free flow of data is in place. Data Governance Act in particular aims to boost data sharing in the EU, so that companies and startups will have more access to data they can use for their products and services. And with this act, access to big data is also envisioned because that is crucial to exploiting the potential of AI. Having the trust is crucial to reap the benefits of data too. And talking from data sharing practitioners, lack of trust is really the biggest barrier to data sharing. And for that reason, the Data Governance Act also incorporates a certification scheme that supports the setup of data marketplaces. On these usual online platforms, users can buy or sell data, which will help new intermediaries be recognized as trustworthy data organizers. Now, I hinted at this already in terms of funding. There are also various initiatives that increase access to data. In terms of open data, for instance, there is data.europa.eu. And in terms of data sharing, that would be an initiative like ours, the Support Center for Data Sharing.
Okay, thanks, Raymonde. Esther, let me come back to you again. So I know this is central to the work that you do as well. So I'd like to get your thoughts.
Yeah, thank you. I fully agree. The technology barriers are often perceived higher than in reality they seem to be. Mostly a challenge for a budget. And the legal challenges are often over perceived as well. And at the same time, we cannot help and answer all data sharing questions with one blueprint or with one solution, not even with one piece of legacy. We have seen how GDPR was not only helpful when it came to data sharing, but often paralyzed many organizations. And this is where the support centers come in. So the European Commission has, as Ray said, mostly two ways of going: its funding and its legislation. And the support centers, so the Support Center for Data Sharing and the now upcoming Data Spaces Support Center, is the funding to intervene to help Europe move into what is in European eyes the right way and is in line with the European values. So at the Support Center for Data Sharing, we try to help organizations to bring data sharing issues on an individual level and to solve them. Because, as I said, no blueprint can be adapted to all situations. No legislation can. There'll always be more answers, and that's why the Commission is establishing these support centers. So some examples are at the Support Center for Data Sharing, we focus on technical guidance. For example, we have an API friendliness checker, which you're welcome to visit. In our legal guidance package, what we did is trying to understand what is already out there in terms of contracts between different organizations sharing data. Because as we know, we started sharing data sending emails, licensing agreements, and it got way more difficult. And there were more specifications we wanted to look at. So what is already in the contracts that is used between organizations, and then we put up a set of recommended model contract terms, so organizations can put their contract and their licensing agreements together in a more easy and a modular approach. And on top of that, for many organizations, there's still the question, okay, and if I got the technical issues in place and I overcome the legal barriers, why would I do all of that? Where is the value? And well, as you know, and I'm sure the audience knows, that to really quantify the value of a data set is so incredibly difficult, because the impact is created by its reuse, and only then can we see the actual value. So the pricing of a data set or a pricing model for a data sharing agreement can be really complex. So understanding business cases and the business model for data sharing, that's something that where we've been put a lot of work in, and that's where a support center, I believe, can help. The support center for data spaces that is now upcoming, that just launched in October, will continue the work with a focus on data spaces, and I'm sure we talk about what is actually a data space in a minute. And here, it's again the idea that Europe doesn't want to put another regulation out, but gives support, which I think is a very good way to not make data sharing in every way obligatory, but to put this support function out. Yeah.
Great, thanks very much, Esther. Before we go on and talk a bit about data spaces, I'm going to just want to reflect a little bit on a couple of things I've heard, and then just throw it back really as a bit of a question. So, I absolutely understand the argument why we need regulation, but the couple of things you've already said, Raymonde and Esther, that I really liked was, firstly, that data sharing from a consumer point of view has to be on the basis of trust. Why would I allow you to have my data if I don't trust you? So I'd really like us to think a little bit about, well, what does that actually mean? And that perhaps is one of the business imperatives for engaging in this kind of conversation with the Centre for Data Sharing, in that, well, this is one area where if you have a new relationship with a citizen or a consumer, they at least have that initial provision that, okay, you've gone through the appropriate processes. I know that I can share my data with you, that you will treat my privacy with respect. But one discussion I keep hearing people come back to me is they get concerned that data sharing means unintended extension of use, in that I've given you data on the basis that you can use it in this way, but if you start to share it with other people, that might actually have another impact, that suddenly that data is being used in a way that I didn't intend. And I just wondered whether you had a thought about that. This perception about the unintended extension of permission by giving one entity permission to use my data, but it then being shared with other entities.
Yeah, well, I love the trust topic, and before we go into why trust is needed, I give you two reasons why trust is not needed. Just a bit as a provocation, obviously, out there. When we talk about the newest way of data sharing, data spaces, we actually often talk about a trustless environment. And that doesn't mean that there is mistrust, but trust is no longer needed, because the utopia of data sharing, where we want to go, is not built on trust, but on code. And the code is the law. That means that the technology enablers that we will be using for data sharing only allows us to use the data in the agreed way. So there is no extended use possible by the technical enabler, and that's why I don't need to trust the other person on the end. But I know that by the governance and by the technological setup of the data ecosystem, there cannot be misuse. So that's when we talk about a trustless environment, which I think is a nice way of envisioning that utopia. Then one other point is, yes, trust is obviously needed, but I also like to bring into our minds that our data is an asset. And as such, I trust the person that handles my assets as much as I trust my bank. So it's not just trust when I share my data. It is about a control and about understanding that this is a currency, this is an asset, and I'm giving this not just as a helpless individual, but I'm giving this, for example, in return to services for free. For example, the Google suite is to a certain degree free, and I'm paying with my data for it. And that's why I want to encourage us to not to think of, I need to trust. Yes, I need to trust, but I need to be informed about, is the service that I'm perceiving worth the data I'm giving? Or do I want to give my data as altruistic charity, means of charity, in a way to support? And then again, it has a value. And that's a second aspect I want to put into consideration when talking about trust. But obviously, mistrusting that there is room for misuse is a big barrier. But just as much as mistrusting that someone would break into my house, it's a barrier of how safe I feel. And there are legal and technological ways to enforce that there is no misuse. So yes, I need to trust, but yes, I need to be informed and get the right legal and tech solutions in place. So I don't need to rely just on my naive feeling of trust, if you want to phrase trust in a negative way.
Yeah, thanks very much, Esther. I guess that at the back of my mind was the experience we've all had with various cookie permissions things. And it depends upon the context and what you're doing, whether you trust the organization, whether you say, yes, accept or reject all, or actually take the time to go through and say, well, I'll allow that, but not allow that. And there is the old axiom, if you're not paying for it, you're the product. So I think that's the one that you said about trust. I think more of us have become more aware of that, particularly as some big tech vendors, and I won't name names, are making a big issue about privacy and data protection at the moment. They see it as a commercial advantage. Anyway, coming back to what we were talking to, sorry for the little diversion there, but I thought it was interesting from what you heard. We mentioned data spaces, and I'd love to know, what kind of real life problems can a data space solve? And is it different from anything that we've known in the past? So, I've been handling data all of my career, 45 years of it, when much of it was on punched card. Yes, I am that old. But are there real life problems that we can solve with data spaces?
Well, I give it a start, and then Ray, feel free to add, because it of course feeds into the examples Ray told us in the very beginning of this conversation. But maybe we take a step back and understand, why do we talk about data spaces now? What is it? Why is it needed? Is it just another word for the same, or is it really something else? And well, I would like to encourage us to think a little bit. You brought your past in, so how we shared data was on a very one-on-one ad hoc basis, often still is. I ask you, can you send me this Excel sheet? And you might do. But if you then have to send that Excel sheet to not just to me, but a bunch of other people also now want to have it, but they would like to have not column D, and the others would like to have a different name, and the others would like to have a USB stick. It just got more complicated because we are able to share more data. As you know, we are sharing it with more people. We have to share it with more people and organizations. We talked about big data, big value, big impact. So it just got more difficult or more complex, and that's why we had funding, we had legislation we talked about, and we had the advent of data intermediaries, data stewards, data trusts, and how they were called. And the Digital Governance Act is focusing on these intermediaries, because an intermediary helps us to share data and get some structure in this complexity. We have metadata standards and interoperability standards in general. But what we're facing now is the idea, if we are not again going the next step in data sharing, we will have a lot of power with these data intermediaries. And you talked about the big data collectors, which are also data intermediaries. And this is where a data space comes in, and is now heavily pushed by the Commission with billions of funding. And a data space is supposed to stop this process of centralization and go decentralized and federated, with the idea of keeping the sovereignty of the stakeholders in a data sharing ecosystem. And coming to Yasmi about real life, and that's, I think, where we should go, because this is all very abstract. Let's think about health, as Ray started. Patients' data. We all are, as citizens, also patients, and often we don't feel sovereign because we don't have the right on the data that is generated by medical institutions about us. Different sector, agriculture, the farmers often don't have the right on the data that is generated by machines on their grounds about their animals and about their crops. And that is a situation as we speak in many ways. And we just in Europe agree that this is not within the European values, and especially if those organizations that generate and hold the right over the data very few, then we are coming into an unbalance of power. So a data space with the idea of decentralizing and federating data sharing through technical enablers helps us as patients or the farmers to keep their sovereignty and keep control over the data that is about them. And this would be a real life advantage, having a farmer that can innovate with other farmers on the way they operate to make farming more innovative and thus more environmentally friendly. It also helps me as a patient if I'm in control and have the sovereignty on my data. I am in control to also, we talk about donation or altruistic data sharing, to give these data for research. It just enables more player in an ecosystem to be part of a data sharing for the good cause or for value creation.
Okay, thanks very much, Esther. Ray, did you want to add anything at all to that? I've got another little follow-up question I'd like to ask, but before I do, maybe Ray, you'll cover it anyway.
I'm gonna give you the floor to ask your follow-up question.
Okay, so it's this. I do see the value of when we have a data space where we do have common definitions, where we have access to data. But one of the things that has come up in conversations that I've had in many businesses is where they've involved other parties is the issue of governance. So how do we make sure that we don't have people who are off doing weird and interesting things that none of us ever imagined with our data? So I wonder whether you've got a governance layer that sits on top of the technical layer that says, actually, we don't want this data to be used in this way. An unscrupulous party, I'm not saying they are, many of them are well-intentioned, but they end up doing something none of us would have anticipated or liked, just because they could get access to the data and they could perform some of these interesting routines on it. So I don't know whether you've had a thought about this governance of an ecosystem like that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we think about that a lot. That's let's say our daily business, because as we said, once the tech is in place and there's awareness for the legal challenges, then the question is, how do you govern it? How do you make it work? How do you define the processes, the agreements? And what the Data Spaces Support Center is now working on is a governance blueprint, a tech blueprint for sure, but also a governance blueprint. Because the first thing that would come to mind is, the intermediary will set the rules. But when we remember, we actually don't want this intermediary to set all the rules and have all the power. So we actually want to have a also federated governance model, which if one intermediary changes her rules and says, well, from now on you need to pay much more for it, then there are a dozen more technical enablers, and we don't need to rely on one intermediary. It becomes just one technical enabler. We use that one, use the other one. There's competition, there's democracy, there's sovereignty. And that needs to work, that needs to be implemented in a governance model. And in this utopia, the code is the law. We don't need a strict governance model. But until we are there, we sure need a governance model, a code of conduct, and technical enablers that, for example, allow us to share the insights of the data and not the data. And beyond that, I'm not sure. Do we need some kind of data ecosystem police? That would be, again, too much power in the center. So we need to come up with, every ecosystem needs to come up with this kind of governance system and code of conduct.
Great, thanks very much, Esther. It is. I guess there's a balancing act, as with all things. That we have to make sure that all of the actors and the players do actually have a stake and a responsibility that goes with the ability that comes with them. Anyway, talking about actors, then, which players should be part of such a data space, and why? What's in it for them? Why should they want to be part of this approach rather than perhaps going their own way? So who and why?
Well, I start because it actually ties up with your other question quite well. Everyone can be part of a data space who complies by the rules. That's also what's the official saying actually about that. It's if you comply by the rules, you can join ad hoc. That's utopia. If you don't, you are out. Obviously, that's a very theoretical idea still, because now we are setting up data spaces, and we need to activate the different stakeholders now. And depending on the data space, and we're talking about Green Deal, agriculture, cultural heritage, media, tourism, there are many, and some sectors already have their, how do you say that, have their unions, and the stakeholders are quite known. But in other areas, there is a lot of work going on now to actually identify the stakeholders with the hope that, well, there's a lot of voluntary participation. I believe there is a big risk that we are starting data spaces with the people that are loudest and proudest in a data space, leaving behind those that not have the resources and time or money, not have the awareness or the access to be part of a data space. So it will be one of the biggest challenges for the data spaces and for the support center for data spaces, to encourage also minorities to be part of it, because we all know how bias in AI is caused. And if even when setting up a data space, we cannot even get the stakeholders on board that have the data that we need to counter bias, then we are engraving the problem. That's why which players should be part, especially the ones that don't speak up, that don't want to, especially the machine producers for agriculture that feel like, no, we're good. No, we don't need to. We don't need to be there. We keep the right of the data. We keep the control. So the organizations who don't want to, feel they don't have the means to do so or haven't heard about it. I think those are most important, and that's a huge challenge for us. And here again, we have to think about what are the incentives. So how can we make the business case for sharing a data space on a very individual level for the stakeholders so transparent that we at one point have something like the most important players, the smallest players. We need some KPIs for that, but it will be not as obvious as it sounds on the first thought.
Great, thanks very much, Esther. I guess one of the things that was going through my mind as you were talking, you mentioned it, the loudest and the proudest. It seems to me through my experience and talking to a lot of organizations that it is the very well-heeled large organizations that seem to get the most value out of this. And it can be hard for a small innovator to break through, often because they don't have access to the same layer of data. And one of the things I know you're aware of is the conversation about third-party data versus first-party data. And of course, data sharing is in the second-party data approach. And it's I think easier to switch to reliance on first-party data when you're a massive organization. You've got tons of historic data. But if you're a small organization, making a breakthrough in those areas, becoming one of those innovators that may actually change the entire landscape, you're probably going to suffer from the ability that, well, we just don't have the data that we could rely on. I know for me, it's an issue I face all the time. How do I get a large enough data set that I can draw meaningful and reliable conclusions that support the decisions we do? So I guess a lot of us I get it. I absolutely understand the reasons for, and I think like many digital transformations, we can make lots of good arguments about why this is a good thing. But I also suspect that it comes with a bit of a cost. For example, you mentioned you can have your own data and you can protect it and it's your irreversible asset. But are there costs associated with not setting up a data space? So there are some costs inevitably. Nothing comes free. but are there costs for not taking part?
Ray?
Well, we're already seeing data spaces emerging. For example, data space for health is already quite mature, and the same goes for the data space for mobility. So it's quite easy to think of how you will miss out if you're not part of it. But still, I really rather like to phrase it as an opportunity for what you can win. And I know we've heard it before, but I want to carry this point home. So it's not only access to a wealth of data from different sectors, also from different vendors, all in one location. It's a way to mitigate compliance fears. It's room for co-creation where innovation efforts can be joined. And this can be in various industries. So think of research, industry, government. Not only that, it's also a way to ensure privacy, ensure sensitivity, to, like Esther said, control the data that you actually generate. For instance, in an agricultural setting, it's a way to include those players that are not the loudest and the proudest. You will have a seat at the table, and the data will not only be in the hands of those few big players. And finally, something that hasn't been voiced, I think, yet, is that we will generate more and more data every day. It will be more granular. There will be faster connections. And if we don't scale this way, then the solutions that we had in place to share data will just no longer be feasible. At some point, it becomes too big, and we really need a new way forward. And we think that way is data spaces. They will be uniquely equipped to deal with complexities that we're facing today. By having a lot of data from multiple stakeholders, we can actually create solutions for big problems like climate change or achieving the sustainable development goals. But we need ways to connect that data, and we think that's through data spaces. And with our European Commission project, Support Center for Data Sharing, we have demystified data sharing from the beginning, supported the data sharing community, and now we show the way forward, data spaces. And for that too, we need a support center, which will be the Data Spaces Support Center, to provide the tools that are needed to actually set up those data spaces.
Great, thanks, Ray. Esther, anything you'd like to add? I know you've already contributed a lot, but
does it mean you're good there? Well, one closing sentence from me: the cost of not being part of or setting up data space for Europe is definitely how we live European values and how we can protect those, the level of independence and sovereignty, and the level of innovation power.
Yeah, thanks very much. And I think lots of things we've talked about. I just want to remind everybody, if you have a question for Ray or Esther, please do drop it into the Q&A, and we'll try and address as many of those as we can. Before we do, I'm going to come back to another topic that we've come on a little bit more. And again, it does go to this issue about trust. Now, we know, and we've seen the evidence absolutely over the last 3 years, that trust in established authorities has been declining since the 70s. So we've got to rebuild that. And I can see why there's value for organizations and businesses in this approach, in having a data center and obviously having the your organizations taking part on that. But I do still think we've got progress to be made in securing the, I guess, not the acquisitions, the consent of the populace, many of whom are deeply distrustful about where's this data going. And now over here, it seems to be we're more concerned with big business, but on the other side of the pond, they're more concerned about what the government does with your data. I was just wondering whether you could tell me whether you've got populations which are actually going out, because I'll be honest, this is not something I heard a lot about as a consumer, that there's this initiative underway and why it's important. I just wonder what kind of outreach you're doing to try and change some of these perceptions, because one of the dangers that I think is that no matter what we find, there will be a cohort of individuals who will say, well, it's coming from you and we just don't trust you. So we're not absolutely convinced that, we benefit. So I was just wondering whether you've made any progress on that front.
That's
a difficult question, isn't it?
It can be answered on so many levels, and I would like to encourage Ray to tell us, because as you introduced her correctly, Peter, Ray is in charge of actually the communication and community engagement efforts that are done. But I must say that only lately European Commission initiatives, frankly speaking, focus a bit more on the marketing and PR side of things. And we often speak with our project about the best hidden secrets in Europe, which is a pity because they're really out there for the practitioners. And sometimes it seems it stays a little bit the same focus group, the usual faces. So there is a good outreach, there's a great knowledge exchange, but it could be spread wider. I'm very much with you. But Ray, that has been one of your challenges for the last years.
Yeah, I think it's a very valid point you make, Peter. And a large part of that is, I guess, transparency, by showing how it works, what the agreements are, where data comes from, where it's going to, which is also which has been part of our reports as well. That way, you can really gain the community's trust. So providing clarity and being transparent about it truly helps. And we have done so for data sharing for the past 3 years, but for data spaces, which is still relatively a new concept, that is very much needed too. So I believe a support center like the Data Spaces Support Center will need to invest resources definitely in navigating this culture change, and giving people the tools that they need to actually gain that trust.
I think it's also jumping in. Sorry. Just to maybe also clarify a little bit the view when we talk about the government, the European Commission and the projects, it's not necessarily us and them. I understand, and I hear, especially since COVID, I hear a lot of they put regulations on us again, like hardening the us and them perception. But when we think of the support center for data spaces, this is a consortium of, I don't know the exact number, I think 20 organizations where we have government institutions, but the majority is private sector organizations, research organizations. So this is EU money, taxpayers' money, that supports a consortium which is very heterogeneous, and not necessarily them or us. And I believe that's also, vital to think about when we say, like, well, it's coming from the Commission. It's ideas coming from sometimes even from lobbying, from big organizations. That's also how the Commission sometimes gets pushed to do these things. And then it's actually thought through and implemented by a mix of players. And I believe that's a great approach, actually. Yeah.
Great. Thank you very much. Now we're coming towards the closing minute or two, but I've got one last question for you, Esther, if you wouldn't mind. I was talking to an organization the other day and about the vast volumes of data they were collecting. And I asked them, why are you collecting all this data? Most of it you don't need. And their answer was, well, maybe one day we will. We just haven't thought of how yet. And I wondered what your opinion would be of that mindset about, let's just collect everything. And we'll figure out how we monetize it or get value from it sometime in the future. And I wonder how that fit within the framework that you're describing.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I never got that question at all. I find it so interesting.
Oh, well, sorry.
No, that's great. Thank you so much for challenging me. Well, you're asking me so specifically, so I tell you I'm the first person to throw away stuff that I don't use. I hate clutter. I hate archives or keeping something just for the sake of maybe I'll fit it one day. With data, I do feel different, especially because vast amounts of data might be a problem right now, but less and less problematic because storing it is becoming easier. Automatically labeling it is becoming easier. I mean, not every, people even stop creating folders for their emails because they say the search function is getting that good. I don't need to sort my emails anymore. I don't know, they must use a different provider than me, but anyway. So we no longer need to make this effort of storing something. It gets easier, and we don't need to put an order in because we have more and more tools to label and find the data, and more use cases. So in that case, I would say not keeping the data, which gets easier and easier anyway. It's not taking space up in your closet, right? I'm fully with them, because I cannot think of a reason why that wouldn't work. I mean, other than being aware of the bias that we always have in historic data, the more data, the better.
Right.
But
Well,
I
we
would be
could debate
curious.
that.
Probably
Yeah, I
there
would
are other
debate.
people with different opinions. Please
Yeah, I
reach
think I
out to
do.
me.
But sadly, we've run out of time, though. So I guess we'll all have to talk about that on another occasion.
Yes,
But
please.
all that really remains for me to do right now is to thank you both. So Ray, Esther, thank you so much for your insights and for telling me about this program. I was not well informed about this. Now I feel a little bit more informed, but I guess I'm going to have to be doing a lot more work to find out more. Anyway, until we get a conversation again in the future, please, thank you very much. Take care. And I look forward to our next conversation. Take care now. Bye-bye. Bye.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.